Chapter 13. Although he was stunned and almost suffocated, Dantes nevertheless had the presence of mind to hold his breath and rip open the sack with a knife which he still held in his right hand. But he was still being dragged downward by the cannonball tied to his feet. He bent double and cut the rope just as he was about to suffocate. Then he kicked vigorously and rose to the surface of the sea. He paused only long enough to take a deep breath, then dived again to avoid being seen. When he came up the second time, he was already 50 yards away from the spot where he had plunged into the sea. Above his head, he saw a black, stormy sky. Before him lay the dark plain of the sea, whose waves were beginning to churn as though before the approach of a storm, while behind him, blacker than either the sky or the sea, the granite giant rose up like a threatening phantom. He decided to head for the Isle of Tibulen, the nearest uninhabited island about 1 league away. But how was he to find it in the thick darkness which surrounded him? Suddenly he saw the Planier lighthouse shining like a star. If he headed straight for the lighthouse, he would pass the Isle of Tibulen on his left. By heading a little to the left, therefore, he ought to place the island in his path. He noticed with joy that his years of force in action had taken away none of his strength and agility, and that he was still a master of the element in which he had played so often as a boy. An hour passed, during which Dantes continued to swim in the direction he had chosen. Unless I'm mistaken, he thought, I shouldn't be far from the Isle of Tibulen now. But what if I'm mistaken? He shuddered and tried to float for a while in order to rest himself, but the sea had become so rough that it was impossible. Well then, he said, I'll go on to the end till my arms are exhausted, till I'm seized with cramps, and then I'll sink to the bottom. He began to swim with the strength and drive of despair. Suddenly it seemed to him that the sky, which was already dark, became still darker, and that a thick, heavy cloud was descending on him. At the same time, he felt a sharp pain in his knee. His imagination instantly told him that he had been struck by a bullet, and that he would soon hear the sound of the shot, but he heard no shot. He put out his hand and felt something solid. He drew up his other leg and felt land. He then saw what it was that he had taken to be a cloud. 20 yards ahead of him rose a mass of strangely shaped rocks, which looked like an immense petrified fire. It was the Isle of Tibulen. Dantes stood up, took a few steps forward, then murmured, "Thank God," and lay down on the jagged rock. So Dantes, he's a sailor, but good guy. So he was swimming until he finally reached land. And Dantes has a connection with the ocean, with the sea, because he's a sailor. He was on a boat all his life, ever since he was a young boy. He grew up in the ocean, and so he was able to conquer it, and he was able to swim towards land. Thank God, and lay down on the jagged rocks, which seemed softer to him than any bed he had ever known. In spite of the wind, the storm, and the rain which was beginning to fall, he went to sleep. An hour later, he was awakened by the roar of a tremendous clap of thunder. He took refuge beneath an overhanging rock just before the storm burst in all its fury. A flash of lightning, which seemed to open the heavens to the very throne of God, illuminated the space around him, and 1/4 of a league away he saw a small fishing boat appear, carried along by the wind and the waves. It vanished between 2 waves, then reappeared an instant later on the crest of another wave, approaching with frightful rapidity. Dantes cried out and looked around for something to wave to them and warn them they were approaching their doom. But they were well aware of it themselves. By the light of another flash of lightning, he saw 4 men clinging to the masts and rigging, while a 5th clutched the tiller of the broken rudder. Then he heard a terrible crash, followed by agonized cries. A 3rd flash of lightning showed him the little boat smashed against the rocks, and, among the wreckage, heads with desperate faces and arms stretched up toward heaven. So Dantes was on land, but he could see that there was a fishing boat that was moved around by the storm, no? And it crashed on the rocks and it was sinking. Then all was dark again. Dantes quickly climbed down the slippery rocks at the risk of falling into the sea himself. He looked and listened, but he neither saw nor heard anything more. No more cries, no more human efforts. There was nothing left, except the storm with its roaring winds and foaming waves. Little by little the wind died down, the big grey clouds rolled off westward, and soon a long reddish streak appeared on the eastern horizon. Light suddenly touched the waves and turned their foamy crests into golden plumes. Daylight had come. In 2 or 3 hours, thought Dantes, the jailer will enter my cell, find the corpse of my poor friend, and give the alarm. They'll question the 2 men who threw me into the sea and who must have heard the cry I uttered. Boats filled with armed soldiers will begin searching the sea for me, and the cannon will alert the coast not to give shelter to a naked, hungry fugitive. I'll be at the mercy of the first peasant who wants to earn 20 francs by turning me in. Oh, you know how much I've suffered. Help me now that I can no longer help myself. So it's not over pa guys. No, he's still a fugitive. The Chateau d'If will find out he escaped. They're going to let out a reward for him. So Dantes doesn't know what to do. He's out of the Chateau d'If, and now the struggle is how can he avoid getting caught again? Just as he finished this fervent prayer, he saw on the horizon that Latin sail of a ship, which his experienced eye recognized as a Genoese tartan coming from Marseille. Oh, he cried, to think that I could swim out to that ship in half an hour if I weren't afraid of being recognized as a fugitive and taken back to Marseille. Those men are all smugglers and semi-pirates. They'd rather sell me than perform an unprofitable good deed. What story could I invent to deceive them? I have it. I'll say I'm one of the sailors from the boat that was smashed on the rocks last night. There won't be anyone to contradict me because the crew all drowned. So saying, he looked toward the spot where the little vessel had perished. A few planks were still floating there, and he saw with a start the cap of one of the sailors had come to rest on the point of a rock. Dantes dived into the sea, swam over to the cap, put it on his head, took hold of one of the planks, and began kicking toward the spot where he estimated that the ship would pass. Okay, so Dantes saw that there was a ship of pirates, and he knew that's the only place I can go to, no, to avoid getting captured again. And so he decided to pretend to be one of the sailors whose ship sank the night before. He said, I'll pretend na lang I was a sailor and all of my crew drowned and I need help. And maybe the pirates then will help me, because if he revealed himself as a prisoner of the Chateau d'If, the pirates will just bring him back to the Chateau d'If for a reward. When he was close enough, he made a supreme effort, lunged almost entirely out of the sea, waved his cap, and uttered a loud cry. The ship turned toward him, and he saw the crew make ready to lower a boat. Thinking he no longer needed the plank, he let go of it and began to swim vigorously toward the boat. But he was counting on a strength which he no longer had. His legs and arms began to stiffen, his movements became heavy and irregular, and his chest began to heave. The 2 rowers in the boat redoubled their efforts, and one of them called out to him in Italian, "Courage." Dantes thrashed desperately for a while, then sank below the surface. He felt himself being pulled up by the hair, then he fainted. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself lying on the deck of the tartan. One sailor was rubbing his limbs with a woolen blanket. Another, the one who had called out "Courage" to him, was holding a gourd to his mouth, while a third, the captain of the ship, was looking at him with that selfish pity which most men feel in the presence of a misfortune which they have escaped yesterday and which may strike them tomorrow. "Who are you?" asked the captain in bad French. "I'm a Maltese sailor," replied Dantes in equally bad Italian. "We were coming from Syracuse. A storm caught us off Cape Mordio last night and smashed our ship against those rocks over there. I'm the only one who survived. When I saw you coming, I held on to a piece of the wreckage and swam out to meet you, but I'd have drowned if one of your sailors hadn't grabbed me by the hair." "That was me," said the sailor with a frank, open face. "It was time, too, because you were sinking." "Yes, I was," said Dantes, holding out his hand to him. "Thank you, my friend." "I almost hesitated to pull you out, though," said the sailor. "With your 6-inch beard and your hair a foot long, you look more like a bandit than an honest man." Dantes abruptly recalled that he had cut neither his hair nor his beard the whole time he had been in prison. "Once when I was in danger," he said, "I made a vow to Our Lady of Piedigrota not to cut my hair or my beard for 10 years. The 10 years are up today, and I almost celebrated it by drowning." Now what are we going to do with you?" asked the captain. "Whatever you like. I'm a good sailor, so you can leave me at the first port you touch, and I'm sure to find work on some merchant ship. Do you know the Mediterranean? I've been sailing on it since I was a child. There are few harbors, even the most difficult, that I couldn't take a ship into and out of with my eyes closed." "Well then, Captain," said Jacopo, the sailor who had saved Dantes' life, "why can't he stay with us?" "Very well," said the captain to Dantes. "I'll take you on if you're not too unreasonable. Just pay me what you pay the others." "All right," said the captain. "Now, Jacopo, do you have any extra clothes you can lend this man?" "I have a pair of trousers and a shirt." "That's all I need," said Dantes. Jacopo slid down a hatchway and came up an instant later with the 2 garments. Now Jacopo is gonna be a bro good for Dantes, no? Jacopo was the one who saved him from drowning. He's the one who yelled courage, okay? And he's the one who gave him clothes. So Jacopo is going to be an important character in this book. "Do you need anything else?" asked the captain. "I'd like a piece of bread and another drink of that fine rum I tasted just now." Jacopo handed him the gourd, and another sailor brought him a piece of bread. Dantes asked if he could take over the helm. The helmsman, delighted to be relieved of his duties, looked at the captain, who motioned him to give up his place to his new shipmate. Dantes took over, keeping his eyes fixed on the coast of Marseille. "What day of the month is it?" he asked Jacopo, who had sat down beside him. "The 28th of February." "What year?" "What do you mean? Don't you know what year it is?" "I was so frightened last night," replied Dantes, laughing, "that I almost lost my mind, and my memory is still confused. So I'll ask you again, what year is it?" "It's 1829, said Jacopo. It had been 14 years to the day since Dantes had been arrested. He was 19 when he entered the Chateau d'If. He was now 33. A sad smile passed over his lips as he wondered what had become of Mercedes during all that time when she must have believed him to be dead. Then his eyes flashed with hatred as he thought of the 3 men to whom he owed his long and cruel captivity. And he renewed the oath of vengeance against Danglars, Fernand, and Villefort, which he had already sworn in prison. And this oath was no longer a vain threat, for at that moment the fastest ship in the Mediterranean could not have overtaken the little tartan as she scudded along under full sail toward Leghorn. Dantes had been on the Gina Mili, the Genuine tartan, for less than a day when he realized that he was dealing with smugglers. He therefore had the advantage of knowing what the captain was without the captain's knowing what he was. He adhered rigidly to his original story, filling it out with all sorts of accurate details about Naples and Malta, which he knew as well as he did Marseille, and even the shrewd Genoese captain accepted his story completely. When they reached Leghorn, Dantes was eager to see whether he would recognize himself, for he had not seen his own face for 14 years. As soon as they landed, he went to a barber to have his hair and beard cut. When the barber had finished, Dantes asked for a mirror and looked at himself. He was now 33 years old. As we have said, and his 14 years of prison had greatly altered his face. He had entered the Chateau d'If with a round, smiling face of a happy young man who has made a good beginning of life and who counts on the future to unfold itself as a natural deduction from the past. All that was now changed. His oval face had lengthened, his smiling lips had taken on the firm lines of resolution, his eyebrows had become arched beneath a single thoughtful wrinkle. His eyes wore a look of deep sadness, with occasional flashes of dark hatred. His skin, which had been away from the sunlight for so long, had grown pale. The deep learning he had acquired was reflected in his face by an expression of intelligent self-confidence. Furthermore, although he was naturally rather tall, he had acquired that stocky vigor of a body which constantly concentrates its strength within itself. Furthermore, his eyes, which had been so long in darkness and semi-darkness, had developed the faculty of distinguishing objects in the dark, like those of the hyena and the wolf. I love this description. Dantes is so different. No, when he was 19, he was a young man. He was so bright and innocent. But now, his face is like it's more serious. It's more intense. He looks so intelligent. There's something in his eyes na more intelligent, and he can see in the dark. All of his years in prison in the dark made it. He can see in the dark like a wolf or a hyena. It's such a good description because now when you think of Dantes, he just seems like a wolf, no? He's dangerous and he's mad and he wants revenge. Dantes smiled as he looked at himself. It was impossible that his best friend, if he still had any friends, would recognize him. He did not even recognize himself. When he returned to the Jeune Amille, the captain renewed his offer to take him on as permanent member of the crew, but Dantes, who had other plans, would agree only to the engagement of 3 months. Within a week after her arrival at Leghorn, the ship was filled with muslin, cotton, English gunpowder, and tobacco in which the excise authorities had neglected to affix their seal. It was now a question of getting all this out of Leghorn free of duty and landing on the shore of Corsica, where certain speculators would take over the task of smuggling the goods into France. They set sail, and Dantes once again found himself moving across that blue sea which he had seen so often in his dreams during his imprisonment. When the captain came up on deck the next morning, he found Dantes leaning over the bulwarks and gazing, with a strange expression on his face, at the pile of granite rocks which shone pink in the rising sun. It was the Isle of Monte Cristo. The Jeune Amille passed it about 3/4 of a league to starboard. Fortunately, Dantes had learned to wait. He had waited 14 years for his freedom. He could certainly wait 6 months or a year for his wealth. He repeated the cardinal's letter word for word in his mind. 2.5 months went by, during which Dantes became as skillful a smuggler as he was a sailor. He had become acquainted with all the smugglers along the coast, and learned all the Masonic signs by which these semi-pirates recognized one another. He had passed his Isle of Monte Cristo at least 20 times, but without a single opportunity to land there. He therefore decided that as soon as his engagement with the captain of the Jeune Amille was ended, he would rent a small bark and go to the Isle of Monte Cristo on some pretext or other. He would be able to search for his treasure at leisure, but he would no doubt be spied upon by the men who took him there. This was simply a risk he would have to take. Try as he might, he could think of no way to get to the island without being taken there by someone else. He was still grappling with this problem when, one evening, the captain, who had great confidence in him and was anxious to keep him in his service, took him to a tavern in the Via del Oglio, which was a favorite meeting place for the smugglers of Leghorn. On this particular evening, an undertaking of great importance was being discussed. It concerned a ship laden with Turkish carpets, cashmere, and cloth from the Levant. It was necessary to find some neutral ground where the exchange could be made, and then attempt to land the goods on the coast of France. The profit would be enormous if the undertaking succeeded, 50 to 60 piastres per man. Okay, so Dantes' problem right now is he needs to go to the Isle of Monte Cristo. He has to go to the island of Monte Cristo so that he can get the treasure, no? But he can't be too obvious about it, guys, because if he's very obvious about it, people will be suspicious, they will follow him. Like, why does he want to go to the Isle of Monte Cristo? He'll be followed and his treasure might be discovered, it might be stolen. So Dantes is waiting for an opportunity that he can go to the island without suspicion. And the captain, the smuggler captain, then asks for his advice. They said, we are going to smuggle these carpets from Persia, no? And we need to go to a place where we can make the exchange. And he asked Dantes, do you know of an island we can go to where we can do this? The captain of the Gion Amelie suggested that the Isle of Monte Cristo, being completely deserted and free of soldiers and custom agents, would be a good place to unload the cargo. When he heard the name of Monte Cristo, Dantes trembled with joy. He stood up to hide his emotion and walked around the smoky tavern. When he returned, it had been decided that they would land on Monte Cristo and that they would leave the following night. And so the captain says, let's go to the Isle of Monte Cristo. We'll use that as a place where we can unload our cargo of the carpets, no? Of the Persian carpets. And Dantes is like, yes, he has a reason to go to the Isle of Monte Cristo. And he has to come up with a plan now on how he can find the treasure without being discovered by any of his new smuggler crew. Okay, it's so intense already. That was chapter 13.